Sorry, I'm just a bit emotional. And we walked onto the land and he bent down and he picked up a handful of soil and he smelt it. He was in his 80s, mid 80s. And he smelt it and he tossed some of it away. Then he spat into his hand. He rubbed his thumb into the soil and then he looked across the land and he said, "You've got some good land there, boy. Feed her and she'll do you well." I never used the soil analysis again to judge soil. I used my grandfather's method. The smelling of the soil can tell me how microbially, biologically, and fungally active it is. If it smells like good earth, rub your thumb in a piece of wet soil and you've gained an indication of soil components: sand, silt, clay. You look across the field and you can see the health of the soil through the health of the crop. Soil science knows approximately 10 to 20% of what goes on below the surface of the soil. And I've had conversations with eminent soil scientists and say, "Okay, how much do you know?" He said, 10 to 15% if we're lucky. I said, "Oh, okay, so if I go through secondary or grammar education, go on to further education, come out with a master's or become a professor with 20% knowledge?" And he laughed. We don't understand what optimum soil health is. If I want to build my soil health, I'd first of all dig, not too deeply, cultivate. I would then put a thin layer of compost. I would put some raw biochar. I'm looking at charcoal dust or whatever it is at about 1 kilo a square meter. I look at a multi-textured mulch, which can be grown on the farm. So you've got things like Napier grass, Sudan grass, miscanthus, branches from trees, banana. All of the waste goes in to one area and you're just grown, chopped, dropped, reseeded, and it will compost. Then you start to see soil health is really improved. But you keep adding your bio inputs and your compost and your biochar until you get to the point where you see no benefit.
Hey, what's up, everybody? Welcome to the Organic Guy podcast. This is your home of organic conversations. I'm your host, the Organic Guy. And right around here, we have conversations on how we can make our food systems try to work for us rather than against us. And today I'm super excited about this podcast because we are having someone who has been involved in the organic movement for the longest time possible. He was part of the founding member of one of UK's leading organic horticultural farms to now really advising growers around the world. I spent nearly, I would say, 5 decades now trying to push boundaries of organic, ecological and social regeneration. He has seen really the movement evolve from what used to be like an idealistic into now what is a global force. So for me, it's a really pleasure to have him in the podcast, and I'm looking forward for him to share really some of the insights on what it truly takes to grow a truly organic world. So he goes by the name of Richard. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Ryan. It's a pleasure to come on in part of East African community and talk organic.
Yes. So as I've mentioned, you've been involved in the world of organic farming since the early beginnings. So I'm really interested for you just to give us a little bit of an overview of how your journey has evolved since then to where we are right now. But before we get to the weeds, if you may, of this conversation, just help us give the guys who are watching the podcast a little bit of context about you. Like, where did you grow up, and what was going on when you were a kid and growing up? What was your environment like?
Well, I was born in 1950 in a small market town just south of Cambridge in the United Kingdom. It's a very historical town that goes back to Neolithic and even before Stone Age, with some very interesting roads. It's on the end of the Chiltern Hills, which are very shallow soils over chalk. And traditionally it was the hunting ground of the kings of England. King James I had a hunting lodge there. My family background is my father came from the West Riding of Yorkshire, and the family were involved in coal mining and the woolen mill industry. And my mother's family came from Cambridgeshire and Suffolk. On my mother's side, they were farming military and the police. Now, I'm talking here from Uganda, so here's my Jaja. And I think he was the person that influenced me the most. I don't have his physical attributes, but I think I've inherited his love of the soil. Back then, food was real, food was fresh, food was seasonal. Poultry and lamb were a luxury. Beef and mutton were the normal, the meat, the vegetables, as I said, and fruits were seasonal. There was very little processing. You would buy biscuits in a tin, not in a packet. And at the end, you could buy broken biscuits. It's another world, another lifetime away. My Jaja's mother, I remember coming to the house. She was born in 1860. My grandparents on all sides were born in the 1890s, and my parents were born between 1910 and 1920. And going to school, I was actually dyslexic, but it was never recognized during the 50s and 60s and into the 70s. So as a child, you would sit in the classroom and the teacher would think you were gazing out of the window absent-mindedly, but actually we're not. We're visualizing the conversations of the teacher. And on that particular school and a number of other schools, we had a school farm, which was about 3 acres. We had vegetables, sheep, goats, cow, pigs, rabbit. And one particular year, we were given the role to feed the animals, make sure the tool sheds were clean, the potting sheds were tidy, ready for the classes. And I think between that and my grandfather, that's where my love of farming and nature began.
That's really interesting to see yourself at a very young age, sort of exposed to farming in one way or another. You got involved in the organic movement around the 1970s, in 1975. Talk us through, like, what was that moment that you said, there's this something called organic farming?
It actually began in a way by default. Being dyslexic meant that I wouldn't be into the academic streams, and at a certain point you have to choose the various subjects, either vocational or academic, and I chose vocational. We worked in wood, metal, but I also included cooking within that. And I remember there were only 2 boys in a classroom full of girls. Coming to exam time, it's what am I going to do? I knew there was no way I would finish up with any decent qualifications, so I decided to leave school at the earliest opportunity and train as a chef. So we start the journey that goes back to my grandfather and that lineage, and then the school farm, and then it moves into cooking food. And that is a beginning of a pattern. And within the first 3 years, I'm a young man, I'm a teenager, but food was becoming prepared into the kitchens. And I felt this was wrong. I didn't know why, but I'm a young man and I'm thinking, this isn't the way I know food. I then found my tribe, which is a tribe of the hippies from the 60s, where we were conscious of environment, social responsibility, food, natural diet, natural health, ecological housing. And after the period of being a chef, food was classed as organic. They were whole food shops. So you would go and you would buy dried dates, you'd buy pulses, beans, rice, you could get whole food bread, you could get some of the tahini, the soy sauce, etc. And my diet was moving towards a diet, and I became a vegetarian. Then I met my wife, who also had similar views, and we initially put a deposit on a house in a town. But by 1972-3, we started to look for land, and it took us 4 years. It took us till December 74 before we found the right type of farm that we could afford, and we bought a derelict cottage or semi-derelict cottage with an acre of land and some greenhouses. There was an undercurrent movement of people growing organic food, but we were so far into the country, we weren't part of that mainstream. So for the first 5 years, we lived there. We grew strawberries, fruits, vegetables, tomatoes, cut flowers. We kept chickens and we kept goats because they were part of our diet. But then one realizes that you've got some chickens and the hen's gone broody, and then you've got some cockerels. What are you going to do with it? You're a vegetarian. And you have a goat, and the goat has young ones, and you've got one female and two males. So we began to include meat into our diet. The organic market was extremely small. We would drive 2 hours or an hour and a half to Cambridge during the summer months and every 2 weeks and take our organic produce. The rest of our crops from the farm was sold as non-organic, but we applied the basic principles of no agrochemicals and feeding the soil with what we considered was composted manure and straw, and we didn't understand about green manuring or any of the organic inputs like insecticides or fungicides. We didn't know what they were. We were very naive.
Yeah, I wouldn't say very naive, but you were just, using the knowledge that you had at that time. It's quite interesting that, yeah, at least there's something going on in the organic movement at that time. So I'm wondering, like, during those periods, is there someone you looking up to?
After we bought the house, my maternal Jaja, grandfather, with my grandmother came up to the farm. And I was very proud to take my grandfather into the land. Sorry, I'm just a bit emotional. And we walked onto the land, and he bent down and he picked up a handful of soil and he smelt it. He was in his 80s, mid-80s. And he smelt it and he tossed some of it away. Then he spat into his hand. He rubbed his thumb into the soil, and then he looked across the land and he said, "You've got some good land there, boy. Feed her and she'll do you well." A number of years before, I came across a man called John Seymour, who became a very good friend. He was an author, pioneer of what was called the Back to the Land movement. So there were many people from suburbia going and buying a plot of land to grow their own food. We came from a different direction. We came from the 60s direction. But during the early to mid and even into late 70s, many people in the UK came back to the land and started to grow their own food. So John Seymour was around, and there's another man called John Butler. And I'd read about John Butler in a magazine called Seed, the Journal of Organic Living. And that was published by a man called Craig Sams, who has been instrumental in the organic sector as an entrepreneur and within the Soil Association. And John and Shirley's farm was actually about 15 to 20 kilometers away. And we went to visit John. And John also said, "Feed the soil." He came to an understanding of the earth through a spiritual journey, not an agronomic journey. And I realize now my journey has also been more spiritual and trying to be at one with nature, whilst building a background knowledge of understanding of how to work with the soil. She will guide us, but she's very shy. So those three people, they all said the same thing. They said, "Feed the soil." And I was a young 24-year-old with one child, two children maybe, a wife, and I had long hair. And I thought I understood what they were talking about when they said feed the soil. Oh, yes, compost, blah, 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 blah. That took me 35 years to understand what they were talking about.
Yeah, you caught on to the movement of very, very young, and I will attribute that to your curiosity as well, but also being like exposed to the farming movement very early on. So that meant you were very aware of what was happening around you. So you're very young, 24 years old. You've just bought like a piece of land, and you're trying to join the hippie movement in terms of growing organically. How long do you stay in the farm? What are you doing in the farm? And what happens next?
So I was already part of the hippie movement with my wife. We stayed at this particular farm from we moved, bought it in the end of 74, moved in 75. And then in 1980, we moved to a bigger house and more land. So in the first 5 years, we were at the beginning of learning how to work with the land, but it really was being very naive and very much in its infancy. We didn't know many other organic growers. We knew a few people that lived close by to us who were hippies, who were growing their own food. By that time, our family had grown to 3 children, my wife and myself, and we couldn't expand on land, and the house was very small. It was a 2-bedroom cottage that was nearly 200 years old. So we moved and we bought a 7.5-acre farm further up on the Lincolnshire Fens. The Lincolnshire Fens are very much like Holland. I know you were at Wageningen. The farms were both below sea level. They were drained by the Dutch, but the soils are the highest quality in England. So we moved from a grade 1 silt to a grade 1, I think you might call it a cotton soil, a black soil that is organic matter. But the market for organic was still so small. We had 7.5 acres, then we bought 2 acres on top of that shortly after, and then a bit later we bought 8.5 acres, taking us to 20. But in the early years, we were cropping about 2 acres of the farm because the market wasn't there. And we'd learned the strawberry trade, or learned how to grow strawberries organically. And I think we were the first organic strawberry grower, but my dear friend Tolly was the first certified organic strawberry grower in 76. So we had a pick your own strawberry business, and then we had a range of vegetables and raspberries that would coincide with the pick your own pea. And our intense period was from spring up until the end of July, when the strawberries and the raspberries had finished. Then I would have to go and seek further work to ensure we had bread and butter on the table and we had money coming in. We didn't have subsidies. We struggled like every other small farmer that is in Africa, hand to mouth, but we were trying to learn skills. We then became involved and had the farm certified. Now, this particular farm last received an agrochemical input in 1978. We then became certified as organic, and then I became politically involved with the organic movement. We were probably 8 years in, and we were developing systems, but the market was still small, and I became involved in the Soil Association Horticultural Standards Committee, which was setting up regulation. Becoming involved, it also brought us into the wider organic community. Now, you have organic farmers and organic growers. Organic farmers are livestock, arable, dairy sector, but growers are horticulture. And most of the growers that I met later were all, once upon a time, young hippies. We went out, we bought land, we started to build the organic sector. The farmers mostly inherited their land. So there's a very, very big divide. But we set up organic standards. There was a magazine called Organic Farmer and Grower, and this had articles in and went out to all the licensees of the Soil Association. And we organised farm walks and weekends and organic conference. And so we got to know more and more organic growers. And we were all frustrated that we had the land, but we couldn't expand into the larger market. So at the time, we were growing about 27 different crops for sale to coincide with the strawberry season. And we were at one organic weekend where I think we were over in West Wales. Now, there are 3 very important people within the UK's organic sector. That is Lawrence Woodward, who headed up the Elm Farm Research Centre, which you may be familiar with. Patrick Holden was kind of the farmer's leader, and he had his own farm in West Wales and also was heavily involved with Soil Association, the charitable and certification. And Peter, along with somebody called Ron Green, had organic packing facilities. This was all around the same time, and a group of organic growers, it was Organic Growers of West Wales, OGWW, had formed. It was a cooperative, and this weekend for growers, it marked the change in the industry that we needed. And within 3 years, there were 5 organic cooperatives. I look back at those years from 75 through to the mid-90s. And they were some of the most exciting times for this industry. We were learning, we were challenging, we were building businesses. So with the help of Food from Britain, we formed a legally structured cooperative. We were meant to have 8 members, well, we had 7. So Roger, who worked for Food from Britain, held 1 share until we could get the 8th member. And Pam and I were actually going to a vegetable exhibition with machinery and seed merchants, and we stopped by this one stand, which was a marketing agent. And we asked them if they're interested in becoming a marketing agent for the group, which we called ECOP. And working with their procurement team, we went from 23 lines or 27 lines down to 7 on 20 acres of land. We were growing 25,000 lettuce weekly as one of the crops. Another grower was growing another 25,000. The third grower was growing 25,000 icebergs. So we had 75,000 lettuce on a continuity program going in from April through to October. In 1 year, we went from a business that I had to go out and work 4 months of the year, 4 to 5 months a year to bring in enough money to survive, to turning over the equivalent of £500,000 in today's spending money from 20 acres. That's a lot of money, but that's where the industry jumped.
What was the reason why there was like a huge bump or interest from consumers?
The organic market was limited to very specialized shops. Some of the small shops that you would have seen in Holland, little vegetable stores selling some brown rice, etc. But the 2 existing packers were already sourcing from other organic growers that had cooperatives. And we brought in the 3rd packer, which meant that Geest already had the major retail sector were wanting to expand their portfolio and bring in organics. So that enabled individual growers to become more commercially viable, to have volume, and the consumer was on board at the time.
Okay, that's nice. So you've, bootstrapped, you've worked hard, and you've sort of like created a business where you're selling organic products. So I'm wondering, like, from the mainstream side of things, obviously there are other farmers who are growing conventionally. What are they saying? Like, what are their thoughts about what you're doing?
Farmers are the same all over the world. If a farmer is doing well, you go up to Thika or you go up to Meru or somewhere, and you go past the shamba, and that shamba is looking good, and the crops are looking good. The same happens all over the world. In Lincolnshire, initially, we not so much at the first one because we were a little bit away from the road, but the second farm, we were right by the side of a local road. On a Sunday morning, the farm workers would be driving by slowly, looking over the fence. What are these 2 doing? And they'd seen the farm really for 5 years. It was 12 years until we made big inroads, and it didn't happen overnight. This was 12 years of struggle. So they would start looking, and then not only were the farm workers coming, but suddenly you saw the Range Rovers. And these farmers have got thousands of acres, 500 acres of field scale vegetables, 700, 1,000, 2,000 acres. They're driving by and they're looking at the health of the crops. They are looking at the capital investment going in. So irrigation, cold storage, upgrading of tractors, specific mechanical machines for weeding within the road, brush weed. They still sat on the sideline at this point. I knew many of them for various reasons. Our neighbours, I contracted myself out to some of the big farmers when we needed money for harvest periods, etc. So we got to know farmers in the community, and they knew us, and we had a reasonably high profile of talking about organic in, for various events and things. I have an inquisitive mind, I've realised, and even as a grower, I felt that we were limited in our understanding by regulation. Initially, organics were standards, and those standards were the ones that people involved in the history of the organic movement, Lady Balfour, Schumacher, McCarrison, Rodale, Steiner, they were all at the very beginning in the early part of the last century going through. And then we picked up the mantle in the 60s and 70s to carry it forwards. And in the early days of standards, they were like a roadmap. They were a manual on how to create a successful business without using agrochemicals. At the end of the 80s, the European Union became involved and wanted to bring organic standards within the Common Agricultural Policy. Within the UK government and DEFRA, there was a guy called Robin Franzella who would liaise with the various sector bodies and each component of certification, so arable, dairy, livestock, horticulture. And Brussels had all of the organic regulations from the various, from BDA and from organic. All of the others, Soil Association included, followed very similar lines, except BDA was looking at the work of Rudolf Steiner and the anthroposophical approach to life. And the interaction over a number of years, might have been a year or two, we came up with what is classed as a European organic regulation. But it shifted from a standard to a legal entity, which is a critical point because in hindsight, I felt that's a millstone. After I left Strawberry Field, I was a bit lost for a year or so, and then I went to a biodynamic unit and worked on a biodynamic unit to understand a bit more about Steiner's principles, even though I'd seen them in Holland, etc., and realized that we're all influenced with the planets. Doesn't matter if we're biodynamic or organic. 18 months in, I felt my experiences weren't being used, so I contacted my friend, Helm Farm, Mark Measures, who set up the Organic Advisory Service. And I said, Mark, look, I'm wasting my time. He said, come on down. So I went down as a horticultural consultant, and within 3 months, Walter Wertz, a Dutchman, a very knowledgeable Dutchman, son of a fruit grower, resigned and went to work over in Wales with Peter Seger. And so I took on the role of senior horticultural consultant. Within that role, I inherited a client base of 600 acres. That got me back to the non-organic farmers on the Lincolnshire Fens who had once driven past, who are now becoming interested in organic. That period meant that I got exposure to some serious farming enterprises. Initially, big farms would convert 25 or 50 acres maximum as a trial because they are all very specialized. The way modern farming has moved is it's become a very specialized sector. Certainly in UK, and my guess is similar in Holland, that instead of one farmer investing in a lot of different machinery, they would work with other farmers with suitable soil types in order to build a rotation. So one farmer could have his whole farm in brassicas one year, and the next year it could be carrots or onions, and they worked together because they were all servicing the same major packer, but they were also bringing in ecological integrity. So it gave me the exposure and it gave me the opportunity to really understand large-scale farming. My client base I built in 2 years from 600 acres to 8,500. Purely because these farmers were wanting to learn, they needed guiding. 2 farmers had 2,000 acres each out of their total of 7,000 acre farms. And one in particular has always been my favorite farm, the way they developed the farm ecologically. It went to 3,000 acres out of 7,000. Ironically, when we were growers, they are a major celery producer. We had 1.5 acres of organic celery. They sent their technologists out to a 1.5 acre field because they couldn't believe you couldn't grow celery without chemicals. And they've got thousands of acres of celery. And 2 hours later, we left them in the field. And 2 hours later, these technologists came back and said, you can grow celery without chemicals. And much later, I was their consultant on 500 acres, of which celery and salad. So the industry expanded big time then.
I have so many questions, but I think the best place to start is just let's start with the basics, and that's the soil. So you mentioned a little bit the importance of soil and how it plays. Just give us a little bit of an overview. How do you describe soil, and what are some of the things you always look at?
If I take you back to 1981 or 82, we thought we knew everything as being young. We'd had 5 years in the organic sector. So we said, okay, all farmers have a soil analysis. Let's have a soil analysis. So we contacted local agrochemical company and they sent out their consultant. He took the soil analysis and came back 2 weeks later and he said, you'll grow Christmas trees and rhododendrons. You will have to apply lime. You will have to apply manganese for a trace element for your brassica crop or leaf crops. You have a high calcium content, which is locking up the manganese. I had a gut feeling that I shouldn't apply lime, and I had no idea why. A number of years later, Elaine Ingham came over from the States to talk about the soil food web. It was the first time that anybody had talked about soil ecology rather than soil science. I never used the soil analysis again to judge soil. I used my grandfather's method. I pick up a handful of soil, I smell it, tip some away, spit, rub my thumb in, I look across the crops. With experience, that's something you can do. The smelling of the soil can tell me how microbially, biologically and fungally active it is. If it smells like good earth, rub your thumb in a piece of wet soil and you've gained an indication of soil components, sand, silt, clay. You look across the field and you can see the health of the soil through the health of the crop. It's the first thing I do when I go to a farm. Soil science knows approximately 10 to 20% of what goes on below the surface of the soil. And I've had conversations with eminent soil scientists and say, okay, how much do you know? This was after a supermarket presentation, morning session with soil science. I said, how much do you know? He said, 10 to 15% if we're lucky. I said, oh, okay. So if I go through the secondary or grammar education, go on to further education, come out with a master's or become a professor with 20% knowledge. And he laughed. We don't understand what optimum soil health is. So we would use animal manures, we would use green cover crops, we would use leys, we would use proprietary organic fertilizers, we would use fungicides, insecticides to try and produce crops without chemicals. And more recently, we had something called IPM coming in, which was integrated pest management. And COPERTs, you probably know very well. We use some COPERTs inputs very early on. That's about managing pest control. But now what we see is we see a proliferation which are having amazing results. But what is not recognized within those amazing results is this is how depleted your soils are. I've worked all over the world. I've worked Central America, a lot of Africa, Middle East, mainland Europe, China, Southeast Asia. I've traveled to 46 countries in which inherently I observe soil and farming. That's part of who I am. I am not separate from the soil. How I judge soil health is about how we learn to manage her. We must replicate nature. If you look at the forest is covered with a mulch. But then we must also think about how we compost, because if you look at a forest, the composting process is not hot. It's a cool compost, and yet when we make compost, we're taking it up to 65 to 70 degrees centigrade. So even after 50 years, I'm still learning. When we look at crops, we must make sure that we grow the crop in the optimum conditions. Some plants like 50% shade, some like 20%, some like open, some like low-lying land, some like free draining soil, some like clay soils. We must, when we're thinking about our farms, look at a bigger picture of what the crop needs, what are we growing, what are we trying to do. When we're talking about conversion, I have to use large volumes of imported mulch on the farm because I'm 75. I want to see the fruits of my labour. But if a farmer is wanting to develop a system, then look at sectioning off a piece of the farm and take it through an organic conversion, but I'm not referring to it as an organic conversion. I'm more thinking of taking it through a biological transition and use your biological inputs and your animal manures and your liquid feeds and your plant health tonics and your traditional methods and get your soil to a maintenance level. That might take you 2 years and bringing all your organic waste onto that section. Let the soil do it. Let the soil take over. She's been doing it for millennia without our help. I think we've interfered too much. We've tried to go a cabbage on the wrong type of soil or the carrot on the wrong type of soil, and we're trying to manipulate the soil. And I don't think we can ever reach optimum if we want to manipulate it.
You mentioned about like not really reaching to the optimal of soil health. You said like scientists know about like 20% of the soil. Should we strive to get to like 100%?
A lot of what's happening and what I'm talking about now has only actually come in the last 15 years. It wasn't there before, but it is just because of my journey. I've been so privileged to be able to go on this journey. More than 5,000 organic growers, more than 1,000 non-organic growers, looking in temperate, tropical, arid areas. It's an acquired knowledge over a lifetime. If I want to build my soil health, I'd first of all dig, not too deeply, cultivate. I would then put a thin layer of compost. I would put some raw biochar. I'm looking at charcoal dust or whatever it is, at about 1 kilo a square meter. I look at a multi-textured mulch, which can be grown on the farm. So you've got things like Napier grass, Sudan grass, miscanthus, branches from trees, banana. All of the waste goes into one area. In the tropics, if you've got irrigation, you've got 4 growing seasons. We can produce serious results very quickly, which is why I would love the universities and research centres to seriously come into Africa. We can fast track because they get 3 months growing season. So my living mulch was sorghum, millet, maize, mustard, and sunflower. Grown, chopped, dropped, reseeded, grown, chopped. Just reseed on top, let it grow, and it will break down and it will compost. And when you think you've got to a level where you can add another piece of land to it so that it will be a smaller piece, but you can keep maintaining the mulch on the first piece and build the second piece. You're moving from a building to a maintenance level on the first piece, then you start cropping. Then you start to see soil health is really improved. But you keep adding your bio inputs and your compost and your biochar until you get to the point where you see no benefit.
You said you've worked like on different parts of the continent, Europe, South America, Africa. I'm just wondering, like, in terms of there's a farmer who has a soil that is heavily degraded, how long will it take them to get into like a good conditioning soil?
What I saw over on the island was I had 5 cover crops in the first 12 months. And all I'd focused on is soil nutrition and rebuilding the soils. And within that 12 months, I only used biochar and the mulches that I just talked to you about. There was no animal manures. And that degraded soil in plant health was showing phenomenal results. Then I'm constructing at the moment there a house. That's one of my priorities. But then we had heavy rains and they were so heavy. The soils are so degraded there that once they're saturated, if you get a heavy rain, we have various depths of topsoil. It was forest. It's now totally degraded. Cannot hold organic matter. So within 12 hours of a heavy overnight 50 mil, 60 mil of rain, it's coming to the surface on the sheet. So it's a big issue. But within that rain period, I lost all my nutrition. If we hadn't had the heavy rains, these degraded soils with irrigation will be producing crops in 18 months. Nature will turn around quickly. If you can get the food in for the microbes, the fungi and the bacteria, which is organic matter and charcoal dust or biochar, some animal manure and some raw animal manure, because if we look at nature, Nature doesn't compost animal manure. There must be something in there. Steiner looks at burying animal manure in cow horns or sheep skulls. The doctors who are studying the human body and the physicists are studying the universe say we are scratching the surface. And it's the same for the soil scientists and the soil ecologists. We're still scratching. We have to go on observation. We have to lead. Science must follow. And sometimes science will get a eureka moment, just as the farmer does. Everything is based on a principle of a beginning to build a deep mulch. Now that works in a perennial situation, and it can work for a rural African farmer, but where I'm at right now is, first of all, we have to prove this. So I've got to rebuild the soils over there for Susie. But once the soils are rebuilt, I want the soil scientists, the plant pathologists, and the entomologists to come in and start to look, not to advise, just to look. And if we can say that this is showing huge benefits, then we must go and talk to the machinery manufacturers to say, right, we want to build a deep mulch system that is very different from, my deep mulch system it is different from the clay soils to the sand soils. We have to understand what's going on. With a clay soil, we need to dig a swale. With a sandy soil, we don't want the water going down. We want to slow it down. So we put deep mulches. We have to open soil structures. It's about looking at your farm, trying to really understand, and go and visiting other farmers who are practicing something similar on a similar soil type. And then if we can get that, then we can get the machinery manufacturers to say, right, we want to make a seed drill or a transplanter where you're cultivating this much only within the mulch, just enough to put the plant or the seed in. We keep the soils in profile, lift them up and drop them down if we're harvesting Irish potatoes or carrots. Don't disturb the soil. Get that thick layer of organic matter, and then you can use cover crops.
Now we've talked about the soil and importance and how to take care of the soil, because of your experience in the agronomic side of organic farming and its systems. You can just summarize the basic timeless principles that an agronomist who want to grow organically can follow to see some results.
I would look at removing all organic insecticides. I would look at removing all organic fungicides as a starting point. I would look at building soil health through mulching. If we look at the pest-predator relationship, the pest is always ahead of the predator, and then the balance tips. If we look at composting production, we see that mycelium run through compost at a low temperature, but once you start to get the temperatures above 28 and 30, the mycelium starts to disappear. We talk about having beneficial microbes, fungi, bacteria in the compost and not having benign fungi, bacteria. We also look at wanting to kill seed. I don't think we truly understand what damage we do in the composting process. If my assumption is correct with the predator-prey relationship, nature mirrors itself across many, many fields, but it all has a very similar pattern. So do we need pathogens in the soil? I'm not sure of the Kenyan soils, but here we have fusarium, big time, here in Uganda. But fusarium in high levels is only there because it's out of balance. So if we're introducing beneficial microbes, fungi and bacteria, as well as having pathogenic fungi, bacteria, etc., at the moment we see the big swings away. So the rise in pest, the rise in predator, the rise in soil-borne fungi, etc. If we build the balance, nature works like this. So if we, as an agronomist, look at the various composting methods, the traditional method of pit composting in Africa, which you're familiar with. So in the initial stages of compost, yes, temperatures are going up and it might get waterlogged and we might be losing nutrients. But what happens after that? Are we bringing in bacteria and fungi and microbes from the soil into that and then taking it out onto the farm? I don't know. So look at your composting, look at your mulching, look at the farm, look at the soil type, talk to old people. Talk to old farmers and observe nature. With the fungicide, we put fungicides on the crop, which takes away both the beneficials and the pathogenic fungi. But if we put a benign fungi on there with a microbial preparation, then there's no place for the fungi to go. And the forest isn't like that. It's just kind of in harmony.
So I'm wondering, like from an African context, so right now you're in Uganda, and obviously you've worked in Europe in terms of trying to put organic farms to work. You can just give us like the difference you are seeing in terms of like organic farming in Uganda and also organic farming, let's say in UK or in Europe.
The challenges are greater here. If I talk about the East African community, pest damage is a huge problem. And I also see both soil-borne and airborne fungal issues because of temperature and humidity in poor soils. But I've also seen the benefits here are you can develop a system very, very quickly because of the temperature and humidity. The breakdown of organic matter is phenomenal. So you can build your soils quickly here. You can have time or you can have money. Which one do you want? The cost of living, say, in Europe is phenomenally high, and the farmer needs to make a lot more money than they need to make here. I enjoy sitting with a rural organic farmer who's organic by default, and he's got the time of day to talk. But you go into Europe and sorry, you can come in from 10 to 10:15 because I've got meetings stacked up. The scale of production in Europe has got so big that we're losing out socially. Say a farmer with 2,000 acres of land, that's one farmer, one family, and giving maybe 5 people a job with occasional labour coming in. There's a different mentality in many ways between the African farmer and the European farmer. The African farmer values time. Yes, they need money. They need security. They have challenges agronomically, maybe greater, but they're not insurmountable with the technology that's around them. And I think the African organic sector can miss some of the pitfalls the temperate organic growers fell into. Going big, expanding. I went into the same trap. I was working 16 hours a day, 7 days a week for 7-8 months of the year and getting 3 months in the winter. Could I have done it differently? Not at the time, because we were expanding the industry, but a lot of that is being done.
So I'm thinking like you worked with large scale farmers and then like sort of transitioning them to organic. And this is one of the challenges that I see locally, especially in Kenya. You have like large scale farmers who want to convert their land into organic because they are aware of the chemicals and what they're doing to their farm. So what is your quick summary of what they should consider?
They should go through the conversion period first. And I see that the organic conversion is already tried and tested, and it works. So follow the principles of organic conversion and organic soil management. And once you feel comfortable with that, then come over to my side of the fence. I can't teach you that, and neither can my peers. We can tell you about it, but you've got to put your foundations down. So the tried and tested route is already in place. A full organic conversion, managing using organic insecticides and organic fungicides and your compost, etc., because that works. That's proven. You can't have economic disaster in any farm. And they're like stepping stones. So get your soils working, then take the next level of looking around your farm. Do I want more trees? Do I want smaller fields? Do I want smaller machinery? And then start to build onto the next level, which is full soil regeneration. You can't do it overnight. During the last part of the 80s, the last 2 years, and taking farmers through organic conversion. One particular farm converted, it was a field-scale vegetable operation. They converted 25 acres. So Jonathan put the grass clover lay in, and then as soon after that they went into brassica production, and he was using pelleted poultry manure and fungicides and insecticides, just as he was a chemical farmer. It's around 10 years later, I was wearing another hat. I've worn many in this journey, and I was training CMI, the international auditors who audit for Tesco's, about how to audit an organic grower to come into Tesco's Nature's Choice. And so over the course of 12 months, we ran 4 training sessions of a week long with about 20 participants globally. And on the last training session, it was in the area where I used to live. So I knew most of the organic farmers, and anyway, there was this farm in this location, and I didn't know it, and the two other people that were looking at different aspects of the training, I said, do you? They said, no, we don't know it. Anyway, it was a 450-acre field-scale vegetable farm, and I got there, and it was Jonathan, the farmer that I took through conversion, or the farm manager. And we walked into a field of calabrese, broccoli, and I said, okay, you guys talk to Jonathan. What do you want to know? We want to see how much they learn. And there were some low weeds in there, and there was some disease around the edges of the broccoli. And they started to focus in on that. And Jonathan said, well, look, the weeds aren't going to seed, so they're not going to leave a seed bank in the soil. And the disease is on the lower leaf of the crop, and it's not going to affect the harvest. And I thought, 10 years, Jonathan, you've come a long way. This journey is long. My advice is to start slowly on tried and tested systems, and then as your knowledge grows, build on it.
How long should they wait for them to see results? I mean, the conventional knowledge says that even a farmer is converting, they should expect about 20% lower yields, and it should take them about 3 to 4 years to transition. You've done this before. Like, what should farmers expect when they're transitioning?
My advice would be to go through the 2-year conversion of land to come into an organic system. And what you have now, as opposed to what we didn't have, is the biological inputs. So focus on the historical way to convert land, a grass clover lay to build up organic matter into the soil, to use animal manures, to use whatever form of composting that you think is appropriate, whether it's the Elaning and soil food web approach, or if it's just stockpile and turning, to use the biological inputs in conjunction with the organic management tools approach, which are already there, because they are going to increase the microbial, bacterial and fungal levels in the soil. And we thought it was organic matter and nitrogen way back. It's not. It's microbial, fungal and bacterial levels. Everything else stems from there. So by using the inputs that weren't there, you're going to fast track. How long that's going to take, I've seen farmers have used the biological input only and get results without focusing on the soil. So yes, you can do that, but if you're focusing on the soil at the same time, you are actually building the levels below the soil, and the plant is able to absorb from the soil. If you just use the bio inputs alone, you're like a non-organic farmer throwing fertilizer. That's all you're doing. So it's a combination of the two, and I think that this is the most exciting time in agriculture and horticulture, particularly with combining the new bio inputs with organic, regenerative, syntropic agroforestry, bringing them all together. And we can use whatever word we want to use, but it's about producing food from biologically active soils.
Yeah. I was actually wondering, when we started, you talked about standards, and you said like initially the standards were meant to be a guide, and right now we sort of transition to like organic standards. So I'm trying to like get to your mind, like what is the role of organic certification?
Yeah, so initially we called them standards or guidelines, and then they became legal entities where you can be prosecuted under law. And during that time of that transition period on the horticultural standards, we were wondering, with this with organic standards coming under EU regulation, is this a thin end of the wedge? I was called a pioneer organic grower by somebody, and I thought, oh, okay, I suppose we are, but we didn't know we were. We were using observation, intuition and innovation to drive the industry forwards. And because of regulation, I think it's stifled progress. As an example, under organic regulation or legislation, you are allowed to put 170 k of nitrogen onto any 1 hectare, or 250 k of N onto any one field, provided you don't exceed 170 k of nitrogen being applied to your farm. Now that made sense, but that piece of legislation was taken out of nitrogen NVZ, nitrogen vulnerable zones for non-organic farmers that were applying a fertilizer that was soluble. So that immediately restricted our expanding to see under an organic system, if we continue to build organic matter, what amount of leaching are we getting? So we were blocked from that innovation. And what I see now is the realization of peers my age who have been kicking around for a long time, is the recognition that that's actually what took place. And they're trying within organic standards to enable innovation and not box us in. And that recognition, I think, will lead through with the younger generation taking up policy decisions. I grew and sold organically without certification until it became law, but by then was already certified. But if somebody is selling direct to the customer, why can't they call it organic or something, use the word organic or regenerative, if they have a direct relationship with their customer? If they are selling to a supermarket or to a processor, then the supermarket actually undertake an audit based on what the farmer is doing, that they are complying to an organic regulation. And then the certifying bodies act like trading standards. So they go round to the market and check a person what they're selling, do residue testing. They go to the supermarket and follow up with their auditing, and they go to they select a number of farms that they want to go to check the regulation, and we move the financial burden of regulation.
It's something I've also slipped into the regenerative movement, because now you see people arguing, should regenerative agriculture get a certification or not?
But that actually happened within the organic movement a long time ago, a very long time ago. We're talking about the 70s. There were discussions about this sector body or that sector body, that their standards weren't as high and as rigid. So we're just, nothing under the sun is new. We're just going full circle. Now, regenerative has come into the equations, and I see my peers in there calling that, you can't call that regenerative because you're using chemicals, or we want to take it under our umbrella and strangle it again. I think a definition of regenerative agriculture can be very simple, but it follows the guidelines of organic regulations, but it cannot include any agrochemical inputs, because those inputs are detrimental to soil and environment. And it simplifies it, and then we can take it on the next level, because we're all still learning.
And I'm interested because you just mentioned like history sort of repeats itself, and we are in this generation where like we have sort of younger people getting into sustainable and regenerative agriculture. What will be one thing that you wish like this generation of organic leaders or like people involved in the organic movement never forgets?
Hear what we have to say. You will hear it, but you won't understand it. That takes time. Try and find an elder mentor to guide you when you are struggling, to not be afraid of making mistakes, because they're not mistakes, they're learning curves. We lost an entire crop of strawberries one year. We had 8 tons a year before, we had 160 tons the next year because I used poultry manure and it was too high in nitrogen. And instead of looking like strawberries, it looked like a field of potatoes. But we didn't die, we learned from it. Learn from your mistakes, explore, challenge. You are young, you have, I don't want this to sound bad, you have the arrogance of youth to challenge the elders to go forwards. And the elder is there to temper that, to slow down. So you already have the tools out there. Follow examples that already work.
Where do you see the organic movement in, let's say, 10 or 20 years from now?
I think what we're facing is a meltdown of the environment. We all have to recognize that. We have the tools, we have the skills, we have a very powerful agrochemical lobby, which is pushing as hard as it can on the other side of the fence. I think globally within the tropical zone, we should be working as quickly as possible to start to reforest, or at least put in agroforestry to help cool down the climate, because trees can grow here so quickly. What grows in 40 years in Europe can be up here in 10. And the industry has grown in the last 50 years from, to be honest, not viable at all. So we can call that zero to 250 billion US dollars annually. We made inroads. We've come a long way. We've just got to go the next bit. But it does require research, policy, training of university graduates in soil health management at the next level as well, and availability of inputs. The other side of the coin is we have to recognize that humanity is on the way out.
It's been really, really great to get to know your story so far and like the amazing contribution you've made to the organic movement. So I was just wondering, like, when all is said and done, how would you like people to remember you in the organic movement?
That is the hardest question of all, Brian. I was a teenager, I was a hippie, I am a dancer, I'm an organic farmer, I've been a consultant, I've been a chef, a father, a grandfather. I hope I've enabled change to live more sustainably on the planet. I'm not interested in having a high profile. That's not where I'm from. I'd rather work with the people in the village who their issues are food security, education, healthcare and shelter. They're the important things for me. And if I get a fond memory of somebody sitting drinking maroo in the village, oh, you remember crazy Mr. Rick? That's enough.
Certainly your impact speaks for itself from you getting involved in the organic movement at a very early age and seeing sort of these hippie guys who have no clue of what they're doing to now developing something to a lot of us young people now can sort of reap the results. So it's really, really appreciated. There's this segment I have called the rapid fire questions. So it's 10 questions. The idea is just to give you quick, short answers to the questions. And hopefully, guys will get to know you a little bit more just in case it didn't happen in the podcast. So the first question is about when you were young, what did you want to be when you grew up?
I wanted to understand myself and who I am and where my life's journey was going to take me. I had nothing beyond that.
The second question is, what is the biggest myth people still believe about organic farming?
That it cannot feed the world.
Third question, who is one pioneer in the organic movement that you deeply admire?
Lady E. Balfour, the founder of Soil Association, for the work along with her peers they carried out in the early 30s or the early part of this century. To my grandfather for giving me the love of soil. For John Seymour for his wisdom and explanations of degradation of civilization. And to John Butler, whose organic certification number was B01M. He was the first organic grower in the Midlands of England and part of the foundation of Soil Association, for teaching me the spiritual side of farming and nature.
The fourth question, what is the hardest crop to grow organically?
The one which you are putting in the wrong location, the wrong soil, the wrong topography.
Fifth question, what's one word that describes organic?
Sustainable.
The sixth question is, what's one thing about soil that fascinates you after all these years?
We'll never truly understand her.
Seventh question, which is one book every organic farmer should read?
Living Earth by Lady E. Balfour, Small is Beautiful by Schumacher, and One Straw Revolution by Fukuyama.
What's one piece of advice new organic farmers should ignore?
Don't adjust the pH of your soil, let nature do it.
Ninth question, what is the one quote that you live by?
Be here now. Nothing else exists beyond this moment.
Last question, if you could advise your 18-year-old self, what advice would you have given to him?
You will hear what I have to say, but you won't understand it for another 50 years.
I feel like that applies to me right now. Yeah, so thank you very much for making time for the podcast. You've been very gracious all this time, like to share your knowledge and your journey so far. So I really, really appreciate. I'm sure a lot of guys who will listen to this conversation will be appreciate because you've given us like a really sneak peek of what the organic movement started at, what it went through, and what we are now. So thank you for doing that. Nowadays, most of your work you're spending it in Uganda, right?
I'm building an ecological home on Bavuma Island. I should move in after Christmas. and there I can write my memoir. I write about the journey. I can play my guitar, cook food, have friends around, be with my wife more. She works on the island. I am retired. I'm not allowed to work in Uganda because I have a dependency pass, which is rather ridiculous given the field that I work in and the current climate issues. But I'm there to enjoy the remaining years in my adopted country.
Yeah. So if you enjoyed this podcast, remember to like, share, and give us a little bit of comment what you learned from the podcast. Really, really appreciate it. Till the next podcast, remember to be organic.